Bueno, para la lectura número 16 seleccioné ese artículo que se llama Financial Fraud, Director Reputation and Shareholder Wealth. Fraude financiero, reputación del director y el bienestar de los accionistas o de pues, el bienestar accionista. Bueno, esa palabra no es bienestar, sino riqueza. La riqueza de los accionistas. Bueno, abstract. We investigate the reputation impact of financial fraud for outside directors based on a sample of firms facing shareholder class action lawsuits. Following a financial fraud lawsuit, outside directors do not face abnormal turnover on the board of the sued firm but experience a significant decline in other board seats held. This decline in other directorships is rare for more severe allegations of fraud and when the outside director bears greater responsibility for monitoring fraud. Interlocked firms that share directors with the sued firm also exhibit valuation declines at the lawsuit filing. Fraud affiliated directors are more likely to lose directorship at firms with stronger corporate governance, and their departure is associated with valuation increases for these firms. Introduction. The recent wave of corporate financial scandals has raised substantial concerns about the effectiveness of corporate governance in the U.S. A commonly held view is that financial scandals are symptomatic of and result from massive deficiencies in corporate governance. This view has prompted widespread changes, including the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, new Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) regulations, and governance requirements adopted by the NICE and NASDAQ. Additionally, organizations such as Institutional Shareholder Services, the Council of Institutional Investors, and the Corporate Library, among many others, have been actively promoting extensive agendas aimed at reforming the quality of corporate governance in public corporations. There is broad agreement that financial fraud leads to significant valuation losses for investors, as has been apparent in numerous recent governance failures. These losses appear to result primarily from reputational costs borne by firms as a result of the financial fraud. However, relatively little is known about the reputational costs for outside directors of firms that are involved in fraud and the penalties suffered by these directors. In this paper, we examine the role of reputation in the market for directorship as an incentive mechanism for monitoring fraudulent behavior. Until the recent settlements in which outside directors at Enron and WorldCom personally paid over $10 million, outside directors appear to face few consequences for preventing financial misconduct. In this paper, we study whether outside directors suffer reputational penalties if the firms they served on were accused of financial fraud. We study a sample of firms facing shareholder class action lawsuits alleging financial misrepresentation under Rule 10 of the 1934 Securities and Exchange Commission Act. We find no evidence of an abnormal turnover of outside directors on the boards of sued firms following such lawsuits. However, there is a dramatic decline in the other directorship held by these outside directors. On average, outside directors of sued firms experience a reduction of about 50% in the numbers of other directorship held, and 96% of outside directors who sit on another board lose at least one directorship within 3 years following the lawsuit. The reductions in directorship are rare for more serious cases of alleged fraud as measured by subsequent SEC enforcement actions or settlement amounts following the lawsuit. We studied three hypotheses to understand the reduction in directorship following class action lawsuits. The reputation hypothesis holds that outside directors bear personal costs in the form of fewer board seats if their firms are involved in financial misconduct. An alternative, but not mutually exclusive, hypothesis is that the structure and composition of board is determined endogenously to reflect the monitoring and operating environment. According to this endogenous board hypothesis, a lawsuit can signal that a firm is in a fraud-prone environment, leading its outside directors to spend more time monitoring this firm and to cut back under other board seats. Finally, we consider the legal liability hypothesis, which posits that outside directors cut back on board seats following a lawsuit in an attempt to minimize their future legal exposure. We conduct several test to explore this hypothesis. We examine how news of a lawsuit affects other firms that are linked to the outside directors of sued firms. We find that interlocked firms experience significant negative abnormal returns at the time of lawsuit filing, a finding consistent with all three of the hypotheses that we study. We uncover support for the endogenous board hypothesis when we examine the probability that a firm faces a financial fraud lawsuit. In a simultaneous equations framework, we find that firms most prone to a fraud lawsuit are also more likely to have an outside director who has been previously sued for fraud. This result points to the endogeneity of corporate board composition with respect to fraud likelihood. However, we also find that the presence of sued directors increases the probability of a fraud lawsuit. a finding consistent with the reputation hypothesis, which holds that such directors have weaker reputation for monitoring. To understand why directorship are lost by zoo directors, we study patterns of departures of zoo directors from boards of interlocked firms. Zoo outside directors are more likely to lose directorship and at interlocked firms that face a higher probability of being sued for financial fraud. This suggests that the decline in directorship is partially driven by the desire of outside directors to reduce their future legal exposures. Sued outside directors are also more likely to depart firms with stronger corporate governance, as measured by the Gumbers by the score. In an even study analysis, we find that announcements of departures of fraud associated outside directors from boards of directors interlocked firms are viewed positively by investors. Overall, our evidence is most supportive of the reputation hypothesis, but we also uncover evidence in support of the endogeneity and legal liability hypothesis, irrespective of which hypothesis best explains the decline in outside directorship. Our results illustrate that outside directors of firms accused of fraud bear a financial penalty to the extent that directors optimize the cost-benefit trade-off of serving on a corporate board prior to the lawsuit. The reduction in directorship indicates that the welfare of these outside directors is reduced following the lawsuit. We estimate the direct financial value of a lost directorship to approximately $1 million. Our findings are relevant to the current debate on the role of directors in financial fraud. For example, Section 304A5 or 305 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act grants the SEC with powers to ban directors from sitting on corporate boards if they violate the fraud rules of Section 10b of the 1934 SEC Act. Our results suggest that the benefits of such regulation might be more limited than expected, since outside director turnover on other boards displays a high sensitivity to the reputational capital of directors. The paper proceeds as follows. Section 2 reviews the relevant literature and represents our research questions. Section 3 describes our data, explains the sample selection process, and presents event study results for firms facing financial fraud lawsuits. Section 4 examines the effect of financial fraud on director reputation. Section 5 studies the effect of the class action lawsuit on other firms interlocked through shared directors. Section 6 investigates the probability of retaining directorship following the lawsuit and examines investors' reactions to departures of outside directors who sit on boards accused of fraud. Section 7 concludes. Financial fraud and director reputation. Violation consequences of financial fraud. Financial fraud typically has a substantial adverse valuation effect on companies. To interpret this effect, it is helpful to understand the typical sequence of information released to the market. Provide a comprehensive review of the enforcement process by the SEC and Department of Justice (DOJ). They note that indications of fraud usually surface with the release of a trigger event, commonly a self-initiated press release by a firm alerting investors to the possibility of financial irregularities. Trigger events are frequently followed by private litigation, such as shareholder class action lawsuits that are filed quickly thereafter. Trigger events could also be accompanied by an informal SEC inquiry, which determines whether further SEC action in the form of a formal investigation is warranted. Formal actions by SEC sometimes result in an accounting and auditing enforcement release. Karpov, Lee, and Martin find significant negative valuation effects at all stages of the disclosure and enforcement process. They show that announcements of trigger events led to an average of 1 day of normal returns of minus 25.24%. Class action lawsuits led to abnormal returns of minus 7%. And company announcements of investigating events are associated with abnormal returns averaging minus 14.4%. Cumulatively, their estimates indicate an average valuation effect of minus 41% for accounting and enforcement actions related to financial fraud. They show that direct penalties account for only a small portion of the value loss, and the bulk of the decline in value results from damaged reputation of the firms. Reputational losses can arise because of managers devoting substantial time to the investigation process at the expense of company business, reduced credibility in contracting with suppliers of capital and customers, and a higher cost of capital. Thus, the evidence shows that reputational effects such as impaired operations or higher capital and financing costs impose firm-level costs. Bueno, la lectura va a quedar hasta ahí. Voy a echarle una hojita nuevamente para mirar qué es lo que entendí, qué es lo que más o menos trata la lectura. Bueno, aquí en esta primera partecita, dice que investigamos el impacto reputacional del fraude financiero para los directores externos basados en una muestra de empresas que enfrentan demandas de un grupo de accionistas. Lo que sigue a una demanda de un fraude financiero, los directores externos no encaran el cambio pues anormal en la mesa. Se me ha ido la palabra, es como la junta directiva, on the board, es como, sí, la mesa para la junta directiva en este caso, en este contexto, y de la empresa demandada, pero experimentan una caída significativa en otros asientos de juntas directivas que llevan a cabo, que sostienen. Esta declinación de otras, bueno, directorship, no sé si se refiere a direcciones, es pues como mayor. Bueno, a ver, eso es como esta caída de otros cargos directivos es mayor para, digamos, alegaciones o acusaciones más severas de fraude, y cuando el director externo pues tiene como un mayor peso, sí, tiene un peso más grande o sí, eso pues tiene que llevar una responsabilidad mayor para monitorear el fraude. Bueno, las firmas que están interconectadas y que comparten directores o directivos con, con empresas demandadas también, pues también, bueno, iban donde que también exhiben como una valoración de descenso en el reporte de la demanda. Los directores afiliados al fraude son, pues probablemente pierden los cargos directivos en las empresas con gobierno corporativo más fuerte y que su salida es asociada con el incremento de la valoración para estas empresas. Entonces habla de eso, de lo que vimos ahí, cierto, obviamente los directivos, los CEOs que enfrentan demandas por fraudes financieros, pues pierden sus cargos directivos en otras empresas, especialmente las empresas que tienen gobiernos corporativos mucho más fuertes. También hablan de que los directivos de la junta de acción que son externos a la empresa tienden más a prevenir el fraude, monitorean más el fraude, y para eso se crearon pues como que haya mayor de estos en la junta directiva para eso, para que monitoreen y prevengan un poco más el fraude. Bueno, por aquí habla como de las leyes que salieron después de hubieron unos fraudes, por ahí lo mencionan, pero no me acuerdo dónde está, que fueron de WorkCom y de esta otra empresa que se llama Enron, si no estoy mal, y bueno, salieron unas leyes que están acá que se llaman Sarbaneses-Oakley, y bueno, que son precisamente para ayudar a evitar estos fraudes financieros. Bueno, hasta aquí lo voy a dejar. Gracias.